So, what if the most enduring institution in Western history, the one we often see through this lens of power struggles and scandals, what if it's also a story of surprising resilience, unexpected leadership, even profound positive transformation? That's the sort of fascinating question we're digging into today. We're going on this pretty extraordinary journey through the really complex history of the papacy. We're using John Julius Norwich's remarkable book, Absolute Monarchs, A History of the Papacy, as our guide. And our mission really is to pull out the most important bits of knowledge, the key insights, kind of offering you a shortcut to being genuinely well-informed about this institution that spans millennia.
Yeah, and it's exactly this kind of dense, rich material that fuels our Mindful Moments series over on our YouTube channel. That's where our AI book analysis helps us pinpoint key themes, sometimes really surprising facts. It's all designed to spark your own reflection, and encourage critical thinking about how all this history shapes, right now. So let's dive in right at the start, the very beginnings. St. Peter, kind of an enigma, right? The book asks this really important question. Did St. Peter actually found the Roman Church in the way we might think? Norwich suggests it's more likely than not he was martyred in Rome, probably on Vatican Hill, but he was likely there for a really short time, not, as a diocesan bishop like we understand the term today.
Right, so not a diocesan bishop in our modern sense. So what was his role then, foundationally? Because what I found really striking in the book is how his elevation, this whole idea of him founding the Roman Church, that actually came, quite a bit later. It wasn't until the 2nd century, it seems, when the Roman Church started gaining real influence, that they looked for justification. And they found it right there in Matthew 16:18. This evolution of Peter's story, it's not just like a historical detail. It really shows how powerful institutions, religious or not, often shape their own origin stories, to justify their authority, their expansion. It makes you think, doesn't it, about the narratives we accept today.
Exactly. And for the first couple of centuries, the word pope, from the Greek papas, meaning little father, just a general term, applied to any senior community member. Rome wasn't this centralized diocese yet.
Right.
And the church really struggled for acceptance, often just sort of existing on the edges of society.
Yeah, you have to imagine living through something like the Neronian nightmare, persecution everywhere, or under emperors like Domitian, who actually demanded people call him master and God. Intense. Yet the book points out that Christians incredibly saw Domitian's assassination as heavenly displeasure. It's a fascinating early glimpse of resilience, finding meaning, maybe divine signs, even in really dark times.
He really is. And despite these struggles, you had figures like St. Irenaeus of Lyons, the book calls him a Levantine, basically from Eastern Mediterranean, who settled in the West. And he powerfully championed Rome. He saw it as the great and illustrious church, to which, by reason of its supreme status, every church must turn. That was huge, arguing for its more potent principality because of that apostolic line back to Peter and Paul, establishing that unique claim.
Okay, which brings us to this massive shift. Constantine the Great. The book calls him maybe the most influential man who ever lived after, Jesus, Muhammad, and Buddha. It's a huge claim, making 2 decisions that just completely altered history. Adopting Christianity personally and then imperially. This wasn't just a personal faith thing. It totally reshaped the church's future, from persecuted sect to imperial power.
Absolutely. And his decision, think about this, to build St. Peter's Basilica right over where he believed Peter's bones were buried. Despite enormous practical problems cutting away a hillside, desecrating a massive active cemetery, it just screams symbolism, doesn't it? It wasn't only faith. It was about solidifying authority, linking his empire to this rising Christian tradition, marking a whole new era for the Roman Church.
Okay, so if Constantine is building St. Peter's but also moving the capital east to Constantinople, how did the Bishop of Rome actually cement his supremacy back west? This is where it gets really interesting because the book reveals this, massive deception, a forgery that lasted centuries.
Yeah, the donation of Constantine. For over 600 years, the papacy relied on this document. It supposedly granted the Pope dominion over Italy, the whole Western Roman Empire, actually. But it was a complete fabrication, likely created in the 8th century, probably within the Roman Curia itself. It proved, as the book says, of inestimable value to the territorial claims of the papacy. End quote. Until finally, the Italian humanist Lorenzo Valla exposed it as a fraud in 1440. It's more than just a story about a fake document, isn't it? It shows how a constructed narrative, once it takes root, can shape reality, consolidate power for centuries. Really makes you wonder about the foundational truth we operate on now.
That's incredible. 600 years. So when it was finally exposed, was there this huge crisis? Did papal authority just crumble? And thinking about that chaos, when the Western Empire did collapse under those feckless emperors the book mentions, the papacy often stepped into that power vacuum, showing this amazing resilience again.
Well, surprisingly, the exposure didn't immediately shatter papal authority, not in the way you might expect. Partly because its power by then rested on more than just that one document. Its foundations had evolved. And yes, in that chaos, it's Pope Innocent who stands out. In 408 AD, during the sack of Rome by Alaric the Visigoth, he actually negotiated with Alaric, managed to save church property, prevented a total bloodbath, even though the city was still pillaged. It really shows the papacy becoming sort of the only effective authority left standing, a point of stability in a collapsing world, proving its worth beyond just the spiritual. So then, moving into the early Middle Ages, you get Gregory the Great, a really towering figure. The book calls him the greatest pope of the early Middle Ages. He famously called himself servant of the servants of God. But his real achievement, Norwich argues, was to implant ineradicably in men's minds the idea that the Roman Catholic Church was the most important institution in the world, and that the papacy was the supreme authority within it. He did this through just relentless work, administration, diplomacy, presenting the papacy as the heir to Roman authority.
That's such a powerful way to put it. Implant ineradicably. And his influence went way beyond just asserting papal power, right? What I found really captivating was his impact on church music, the basis for Gregorian chant. Establishing the Schola Cantorum, maybe the first real choir, separate from the clergy. And his book, Liber Regulae Pastoralis, was apparently incredibly widely read. King Alfred the Great even translated it. Plus, nearly 1,000 of his letters survive, which is why he's a doctor of the church. It shows that mix of spiritual and cultural leadership really solidifying things.
Definitely. The book then goes into the really complex dynamics between popes and emperors like Charlemagne. Charlemagne was crowned by the pope, but later just ignored papal views on theology, like the whole filioque clause dispute. It also covers doctrinal arguments and that tragic split with the Eastern Church in 1054, which the book pretty bluntly puts down to bigotry and pig-headedness on both sides, deep-seated differences that finally just broke everything.
Right, and then you get the really dark chapter, the so-called pornocracy. The book describes it as shameless debauchery, papal power influenced by powerful Roman women, often scandalously under figures like Benedict the Next. You'd think that kind of widespread corruption would just shatter the institution. How did it actually survive that?
It's a genuine paradox, isn't it? The book suggests it was, well, a mix of things. The deep-rooted faith of many, the simple lack of other unifying institutions, and honestly, some really savvy political moves. Like Pope Nicholas III, facing a rival anti-pope and no emperor to help, he actually called on the Normans for aid, which ended up bringing the church back into the Balkans and totally shifting the power balance in southern Italy. It shows that even at its lowest points, the papacy found pragmatic ways to use alliances, hold on to power, sometimes even expand it. Then there's Hadrian V, the only English pope ever. Reigned 1154 to 1159. He had huge struggles fighting the Roman commune, clashing constantly with Frederick Barbarossa. His use of certain words like confer and beneficia when talking about the Holy Roman Empire. It implied Frederick held the empire as a gift, a sort of fief from the Pope. That nearly started a war right there with Frederick's princes. It just highlights how persistently the papacy pushed its claim to temporal, earthly power. Even tiny words could ignite huge conflicts.
So putting that in perspective, despite all the internal messes and external threats, the papacy just kept pushing its authority, relentlessly. And even though Hadrian the himself apparently died embittered and disappointed, that Lombard League, the alliance of Italian cities with the papacy against Frederick, it actually strengthened papal influence in the long run. It shows how even if one pope faced setbacks, the institution itself could leverage situations, build alliances, and lay the groundwork for future strength. It's quite something. Okay, moving forward into the Renaissance, we often think of popes like Alexander VI, the Borgia Pope, as purely controversial, right? The book definitely confirms his questionable means, no doubt about that. But it also gives him serious credit for persuading King Charles VIII of France to actually leave Rome, which, the book argues, saved the papacy from becoming basically puppets of the French. So strategic smarts mixed in with all the scandal.
Absolutely. And his successor, Julius II, the famous warrior pope, he went even further, securing the papal states militarily, really cementing the church's earthly power through campaigns and diplomacy, very much a political ruler. But his successor, Leo X, the book calls him a disaster as pope, spent fortunes on art, his own lifestyle, left the church teetering on the edge of, well, the Reformation, religious revolution. That whole period just vividly shows this intense, often contradictory mix of worldly power, personal indulgence, and spiritual responsibility, and how failings at the top could have massive historical ripple effects.
Yeah, huge consequences. Which led, of course, to the Counter-Reformation, the church pushing back, reforming itself. Paul III approving the Jesuits, for example. They became the spearhead of that movement, as the book says. Despite their own checkered history, they fundamentally changed the church's game in education, missionary work, intellectual powerhouses.
Definitely. And what's really remarkable in that era is Sixtus V. He was only pope for 5 years.
Yeah.
But he's responsible for so much of the full Baroque splendor of Counter-Reformation Rome. Just transformed the city. He finished St. Peter's Dome, built a new Lateran palace, laid out these huge straight avenues connecting the main pilgrimage sites.
Yeah.
It shows this incredible focus on tangible impact, projecting strength, institutional power, spiritual renewal all at once. A visible statement.
So connecting the dots now as we get closer to the modern era, how does the book show the papacy navigating things like world wars, communism, massive social shifts? What was the survival strategy then?
It seems to be a story of constant adaptation, often driven by individual acts of courage within the institution. For instance, while Pius XII faced a lot of criticism for his public silence during the Holocaust, the book points out that his nuncio in Budapest, Monsignor Angelo Rota, made official protests against the persecution of Jews. And that was apparently the very first time such a thing had been done by a papal diplomatic representative. So individual bravery within the system, even when the overall response was, let's say, complex. And that really raises the question, how did the church adapt more broadly to the 20th century? You look at John 23rd, he just opened up the church, as they say. Reached out not only to other Christians, but significantly to Jews, famously stopped his car once to bless worshipers outside a Rome synagogue. And during the war, while he was apostolic delegate in Turkey, he saved thousands of Jewish children by providing blank baptismal certificates. That's an incredible story of personal moral courage having a huge impact in the darkest of times. Shows the papacy's capacity for real compassion.
Wow. And John Paul I, too, the first pope with a double name. He also showed this maybe surprising progressive side. It's pretty well known he secretly argued that the contraceptive pill should be permitted by the church, which totally went against the official line at the time, even though his recommendation wasn't adopted. It hints at this internal dynamism, this push for change that sometimes bubbles up, even if it doesn't immediately succeed. What an absolutely incredible story we've traced. From those really contested origins, brutal persecutions, to becoming the central pillar of Western civilization, surviving corruption from within, massive pressure from outside. The papacy's history, as told in this book, it's just a constant story of reinvention, surprising influence, and, well, undeniable resilience.
Yeah, it really is. And this ongoing narrative, with all its tangled complexities, its contradictions, that's exactly what we love digging into in our mindful moments on YouTube and here on our podcasts. It really pushes us, and hopefully you too, to think critically about institutions, about power, about human nature itself, drawing lessons from the past for today.
So here's a final thought to mull over. The papacy, with all its flaws, has outlasted empires, dynasties, entire ideologies. What does its sheer endurance, even when led by figures the book calls feckless or corrupt? What does that tell us? Maybe about a deep human need for some kind of central spiritual authority, even one tangled up with immense worldly power. Something to think about. If this whole discussion sparked your curiosity, just imagine what else you'll find in the book itself. You can find John Julius Norwich's Absolute Monarchs, A History of the Papacy, using the link in our show notes. Please subscribe to our show so you don't miss our next exploration. Share this with a friend who loves history. And always, always remember to think critically about the information you encounter.